She leaned close, smiling like she had won a game, and whispered that feeding me was a waste of money. My table sat in the shadows with no water, no name card, and no silverware. The worst part was watching my parents nod in agreement as I stood there humiliated. They had no idea I was walking out with more than just shame. I was holding the evidence that would make them pay the ultimate price for underestimating me. My name is Lucy Holmes, and as I stood in the peripheral vision of 500 guests at the most expensive resort in Carmel by the Sea, I realized that humiliation has a very specific temperature. It is not the burning heat of anger, nor is it the icy shiver of fear. It is a room temperature stagnancy, a suffocating stillness that makes you feel as though the air conditioning has been cut off only in the 2 square feet of space you occupy. The venue was a masterpiece of coastal wealth. Floor-to-ceiling windows framed the Pacific Ocean, which churned in a violent, picturesque gray against the cliffs. Inside, the air smelled of white roses, expensive Chardonnay, and the distinct metallic tang of social anxiety masked by designer perfume. My sister, Brielle, had insisted on this location. She wanted a fairy tale, and in our family, what Brielle wanted, the world was expected to manifest. I had navigated the labyrinth of round tables draped in heavy ivory linen. Looking for my place card, I moved past the head table, past the immediate family zone, and past the college friends. I kept walking until I reached the back wall, where the service doors swung open and shut, letting out bursts of kitchen noise and the smell of reheating filet mignon. And there it was, table 29. It was not really a table, it was a small, shaky bistro round, the kind used for cocktail hours, jammed aggressively behind a decorative structural column wrapped in fake ivy. From where I stood, I could not see the bride and groom's dais. I could not see the dance floor. I could technically barely see the room. But the worst part was not the location. The worst part was the surface of the table. Every other table in the hall was a landscape of gleaming silverware, crystal water goblets, gold-rimmed charger plates, and folded napkins that looked like origami swans. My table was bare. It was just exposed. Scratched wood. There was no water glass. There was no fork. There was not even a printed menu card. It looked less like a seat for a guest and more like a holding area for lost luggage. A waiter hurried past, balancing a tray of champagne flutes. He was young, probably a college student working the weekend shift, and he had the harried look of someone trying to avoid a disaster. "Excuse me," I said, keeping my voice low. "I think there has been a mistake. My table hasn't been set." He stopped, but he did not look surprised. He looked pained. He glanced at the table number, then at me, and finally at the floor. "I am sorry, Miss," he said, his voice dropping to a whisper. "I was given specific instructions regarding table 29. "Instructions?" I asked. He shifted his weight, looking over his shoulder as if he expected a manager to tackle him. "I was told this table is self-managed," he said. The phrase hung in the air. Absurd and cruel. Self-managed. At a black-tie wedding where the flower arrangements cost more than my first car. "I do not understand," I said, though the sinking feeling in my gut told me I understood perfectly. "It means we are not servicing this station," he said, backing away. "I am sorry." I stood there, my hand gripping the back of the empty wooden chair. The murmur of the room seemed to rise in volume. I could feel eyes on me, not many, just the people at the nearby tables who had realized something was wrong. They were watching with that detached, hungry curiosity people have when they see a car accident on the side of the highway. They do not want to help, but they definitely want to see the damage. Then the crowd parted. Brielle floated toward me. She looked stunning. I had to give her that. Her dress was a custom Vera Wang that hugged her frame before exploding into layers of silk tulle. Her hair was pulled back in a chignon so tight it must have given her a headache. But her face was serene. She glided over to my corner of shame, a glass of sparkling water in her manicured hand. She did not shout. Brielle never shouted. She knew that true power was making people lean in to hear you insult them. She stepped into my personal space, smelling of vanilla and arrogance. She looked at the bare table, then up at my face, her smile widening just a fraction. "I see you found your spot," she said. "Brielle, where's the silverware?" I asked, my voice steady despite the trembling in my knees. "Where's the water?" She laughed, a light, tinkling sound that probably sounded charming to anyone outside a 5-foot radius. To me, it sounded like a guillotine blade dropping. "Oh, Lucy," she sighed, shaking her head as if I were a slow-witted child. "Look at you. We both know feeding you a 3-course meal is a waste. You would just complain about the gluten or the calories." I stared at her. It was not about the food. It was never about the food. "So you decided to starve me at your wedding?" I asked. "I decided not to waste money," she corrected, her voice dropping to a steel whisper. "Put your gift on the main table and go. You were only invited for the photos anyway, and we have already taken those." I looked past her. I needed an ally. I needed a parent. My mother, Diane, and my father, Mark, were standing 10 feet away, near table 5. They were watching. They had been watching the whole time. "Mom," I said, projecting my voice just enough to bridge the gap. Diane looked at me. For a second, I saw a flicker of discomfort in her eyes, the old reflex of a mother realizing her child is being hurt. But then she looked at Brielle, the golden child, the bride, the success story, and the flicker died. She turned her head, pretending to examine a floral centerpiece. "Dad?" I said. Mark did not look away. He looked right at me, his face set in a hard line. He walked over, not to comfort me, but to contain the situation. He stopped beside Brielle, forming a united front. "Keep your voice down. Lucy," he said. His tone was cold, the kind of voice he used when he was negotiating a bad deal. "Do not make a scene. Do not embarrass this family." The injustice of it hit me so hard, I actually felt dizzy. I was being kicked out, starved, and humiliated, and his only concern was that I might make a noise while they did it. "You agree with this?" I asked him. "You think this is okay?" "It is her day," Mark said, adjusting his cufflinks. "If she wants you to leave, you leave. Stop being dramatic." The room had gone quiet in our immediate vicinity. The whispering had stopped. People were listening. They were not listening with sympathy. They were listening because this was entertainment. I was the unloved sister, the disruption, the glitch in the perfect matrix of Brielle's day. Something inside me snapped, but it was not a loud snap. It was the quiet click of a lock engaging. For years, I had taken it. I had taken the passive-aggressive comments, the forgotten birthdays, the subtle exclusions. I had played the role of the shadow so Brielle could be the light. But standing there, looking at the empty table that represented exactly how much space they thought I deserved in their lives, I realized I was done playing. I stood up straighter. I smoothed the fabric of my dress. I looked at Brielle, whose smile was starting to falter just slightly because I was not crying. I looked at Mark, who was waiting for me to crumble. I looked at Diane, who was still studying the flowers like her life depended on it. "Okay," I said. The word was soft, but it carried in the silence. Brielle rolled her eyes. "Good. Bye, Lucy." I took a step toward the exit, then stopped and turned back to face them one last time. I made sure to look Brielle directly in the eyes. "I will go," I said, "but remember my words. Today does not end here." Brielle scoffed, turning her back on me to signal the conversation was over. Mark let out a sigh of relief. Thinking he had successfully managed the problem, they had no idea. I turned and walked toward the double doors. I did not run. I did not rush. I walked with the measured pace of someone who has a schedule to keep. As I pushed through the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool, salt-heavy air of the corridor, I slid my hand into the pocket of my blazer. My fingers brushed against the cool plastic of a USB drive and the sharp edge of a thin, white envelope. I was not leaving empty-handed. I was leaving with ammunition. My heart was hammering against my ribs, but my mind was remarkably clear. I did not feel the crushing weight of sadness I usually felt when they treated me like dirt. Instead, I felt a strange, electric clarity. They thought they were dismissing a nuisance. They thought they were taking out the trash. But as I walked past the concierge desk and out toward the valet stand, I knew the truth. They had just signed their own death warrants. Not physically. Of course, I was not violent, but by the time I was done with them, they would wish I had just broken their legs. I squeezed the USB drive in my pocket, feeling the hard edges press into my palm. It was time to teach the Holmes family a lesson about risk management. To understand why I walked out of that resort with a USB drive instead of a tear-stained handkerchief, you have to understand where I came from. I grew up in the suburbs of Fort Collins, Colorado, a place where the grass is always cut to exactly 2 inches and the secrets are buried under layers of mulch and politeness. It was the kind of neighborhood where families did not scream at each other. Instead, they bought newer cars, planted bigger hydrangeas, and let the silence do the screaming for them. In our house, the silence was heavy, but the hierarchy was crystal clear. If you were to open any Holmes family photo album from 1995 to 2010, you would see a very specific pattern. Brielle was always in the center. Brielle blowing out candles. Brielle holding a dance trophy. Brielle standing on the front porch in her homecoming dress, radiating that golden, effortless confidence that comes from never having been told no. And me? I was the blur in the background. I was the elbow on the edge of the frame. Most often, I was the one holding the disposable camera, squinting through the plastic viewfinder, capturing the evidence of a life I was technically living but not actually participating in. My mother, Diane, had 2 voices. One was for Brielle. It was a soft, melodic coo, the kind of voice you use for a prize-winning show dog or a very fragile orchid. She would look at Brielle with eyes that went soft at the edges, stroking her hair and telling her that she was destined for greatness. The other voice was for me. It was not mean, exactly. It was functional. It was the voice you use to order a coffee or ask someone to move out of the way in a grocery aisle. It was flat, transactional, and devoid of warmth. Then there was my father, Mark. Mark did not care about softness. Mark cared about the resume. He was a man who believed that human worth was calculated by job titles and annual bonuses. He looked at his children like investments. Brielle was the high-yield stock, flashy, promising, the thing you brag about to your golf buddies. I was the savings bond you forgot you bought. Safe, boring, and yielding almost no interest. But growing up in the shade has one distinct advantage. When you are not the one basking in the light, your eyes adjust to the dark. You start to see the things that the people in the spotlight are too blinded to notice. I developed my instinct early. It was a physical sensation, a tightening in my stomach that happened whenever the picture did not match the reality. I learned to read the micro-expressions that flashed across my parents' faces before they put their masks back on. I learned to hear the lies in the pitch of a voice. The definitive moment, the moment I stopped being just a disappointed daughter and started becoming a dangerous observer, happened when I was 16 years old. My father had brought a business partner home for dinner. His name was Gary, and he was pitching my father on a land development deal just outside of Denver. The atmosphere in the dining room was thick with performative masculinity. My father was pouring expensive scotch, laughing too loudly, desperate to show that he was a player in the big leagues. I sat at the end of the table, pushing peas around my plate, watching Gary. He was charming. He had a smile that showed all his teeth and a laugh that shook his shoulders. But I saw his hands. While his mouth was talking about 20% returns and guaranteed equity, his hands were shredding his napkin under the table. He kept checking his watch, not with impatience, but with anxiety, every time my father asked a specific question about the zoning permits. Gary's eyes would dart to the left, just for a fraction of a second, before he gave a vague, confident answer. I felt that cold prickle on the back of my neck. He was lying. The whole thing was a fabrication. After dinner, while Brielle was in the living room playing the piano to entertain the guest, I followed my father into the kitchen. He was flushed with excitement, already mentally spending the profits. "Dad," I said. He did not look at me. He was busy refilling the ice bucket. "What is it? Lucy? Do not sign the contract," I said. He stopped and finally looked at me. It was a look of pure annoyance, like I was a fly buzzing around his head. "Excuse me?" "He is lying." I told him. My voice shook, but I forced the words out. "I do not know what it is. But the zoning isn't real. He is nervous. He is desperate for the check. If you give him that money, you are never going to see it again." My father laughed. It was a harsh, barking sound. "Lucy, stick to your homework. You do not know the first thing about business. Gary is a reputable developer. This is how the real world works. We take risks. We make money. Now go upstairs. You are embarrassing me." I went upstairs. I sat on the stairs in the dark and listened to the pen scratch across the paper in the study. I heard the clink of glasses as they toasted. 6 months later, the news broke. Gary was not a developer. He was running a Ponzi scheme that had swallowed the savings of 20 families in the tri-state area. The land he had sold my father was protected wetlands. It could never be built on. It was worthless mud. We lost $40,000. In a wealthy family, $40,000 is not bankruptcy, but it is a significant wound. It meant no summer vacation that year. It meant the tension in the house was so thick you could choke on it. Mark spent weeks pacing the hallway, shouting into his phone, threatening lawsuits that would go nowhere because Gary was already in a non-extradition country with the money. I waited for the apology. I was naive back then. I actually thought that because I had been right, because I had tried to save them, they would look at me differently. I thought my father would say he should have listened. I thought my mother would acknowledge that I had seen what they missed. That moment never came. Instead, they resented me. They could not look at me without being reminded of their own stupidity. I became a living mirror of their failure. When I walked into a room, the conversation would die. Brielle, who had known nothing about the deal, was still the golden child, creating a distraction with her drama club productions and her student council campaigns. I was the ghost in the corner, the one who knew the truth they wanted to forget. That was when I understood the most important lesson of my life. Being right is useless if you do not have leverage. Truth without proof is just noise. I stopped warning them. I stopped trying to be the savior. I retreated further into the background, but I changed the way I watched. I stopped looking for approval and started looking for data. I began to treat my family not as people who might love me, but as subjects in a study. I noticed when Brielle's grades slipped and my mother bribed the principal with a donation to the new gym fund. I noticed when my father claimed business expenses for trips that were clearly vacations. I saw it all. I cataloged it. I remembered dates. I remembered names. I remembered the exact tone of voice they used when they thought no one was listening. Brielle grew up believing the world was a stage built for her performance. She thrived in the spotlight, convinced that her charm would always protect her. I grew up in the shadows, and I learned that the shadows are where the real work happens. The shadows are where you find the wires, the trapdoors, and the cracks in the foundation. They thought I was quiet because I was weak. They thought I was invisible because I did not matter. But as I stood in that wedding hall years later, watching them laugh at my empty table, I knew something they did not. I had spent 15 years in the dark, and I had perfect night vision. My transition from a silent observer to a weaponized professional did not happen overnight. It happened in a windowless seminar room during my junior year of college. Thanks to a woman named Judith Kane, I had been floating through my business degree, getting good grades but feeling entirely disconnected from the curriculum. The professors talked about synergy and leadership styles, but all I could see were the cracks in their theories. One afternoon, a sociology professor named Dr. Aris stopped me after class. He had noticed my essays were less about the subject matter and more about the structural flaws in the arguments presented. He handed me a business card with nothing on it but a name and a phone number. He told me that I was wasting my time learning how to build businesses and that I should learn how to salvage them instead. He said Judith Kane was the person to teach me. Judith was not a teacher. She was a legend in the dark, quiet corners of the corporate world, She was a risk management consultant, but that title was too boring for what she actually did. Judith was the person companies called when a CEO was embezzling funds, or when a merger smelled wrong but the lawyers could not prove why. She was 60 years old, wore tailored suits that cost more than my tuition, and had eyes that looked like they were constantly scanning a balance sheet. Our first meeting was not an interview, it was a test. I walked into her office, and she did not say hello. She slid a thick stack of stapled documents across her glass desk. She told me I had 10 minutes. She said there was a discrepancy in the vendor list for a mid-sized logistics company and asked me to find it. I did not need 10 minutes. I needed 3. I pointed to a recurring payment for consulting services to a firm based in Delaware. I noted that the billing dates always aligned with the dates the vice president of operations took personal leave. I also noted that the font on the invoices was slightly different from the standard template used by other vendors, a difference of maybe half a point in size. But it was there. Judith did not smile. She just nodded, took the file back, and told me that I was hired. She was the first person who did not call me sensitive. She did not call me paranoid. She told me that I had high-functioning pattern recognition. She explained that most people walk through life filtering out 90% of the information around them so they can function. I did not have that filter. I absorbed everything. And while that made family dinners exhausting, it made me incredibly dangerous in a boardroom. For the next 5 years, Judith rebuilt me. She taught me that gut feelings are useless without documentation. If I felt something was wrong, I had to find the paper trail that proved it. I learned forensic accounting. I learned how to read a contract not for what it said, but for what it omitted. I learned to watch hands during a negotiation. If a man touches his tie knot, he is defensive. If he rubs his nose, he is hiding something. If he freezes when a specific number is mentioned, that is the number that will kill him. After I graduated, I did not go to work for a bank or a marketing firm. I became a ghost consultant for a firm Judith operated called North Bay Strategy and Risk. North Bay did not have a flashy website. We did not advertise. Our clients were board members and high-net-worth individuals who needed quiet solutions to loud problems. My job was to analyze risk profiles, conduct due diligence on potential partners, and occasionally dismantle frauds before they could sign on the dotted line. I was good at it. I was very good at it. By the time I was 25, I was making 6 figures. By 27, my hourly rate was higher than my father's weekly salary. But my family knew none of this. To Diane and Mark, I was just Lucy, the daughter who was struggling to find her footing, because I worked from home, usually sitting on my sofa with a laptop and a mug of tea. They assumed I was unemployed, or working some low-level gig economy job. They saw me in sweatpants and assumed I had given up on life. They did not see that the email I was typing was advising a tech conglomerate on how to avoid a hostile takeover. I let them believe it. In fact, I encouraged it. It was safer that way. If they knew I had money, the dynamic would shift. They would not respect me. They would just expect me to pay for things. They would see me as a resource, not a person. So I played the role they wrote for me. I was the failure. I was the cautionary tale. However, I did not completely separate myself. Old habits of seeking approval die hard, even when you know better. When my father's bonus was cut 3 years ago, the roof on the family house in Fort Collins started to leak. Mark was pacing the kitchen, complaining about the cost of contractors. 2 days later, a roofing company called him. They said they had a surplus of materials from a canceled job and could do the repair for 20% of the market rate. Mark thought he was a genius negotiator. He bragged about his luck for weeks. He did not know that I had called the company, paid the difference of $8,000 up front, and made them sign a non-disclosure agreement stating they would never reveal the source of the funds. When my mother's car insurance lapsed because she forgot to renew the policy during a manic episode of shopping for Brielle's engagement party, I reinstated it. I paid the penalty fees. I set it to auto-renew on my credit card. I paid for the upgraded HVAC system when the furnace died. I paid for the landscaping service that kept the lawn looking perfect for Brielle's visits. I did all of this from the shadows. I told myself I was doing it because I was a good daughter. But Judith told me the truth during one of our weekly debriefs. She told me I was paying them taxes. She said I was paying for the right to exist in their space without being hassled. She warned me that it was a bad investment because I was putting equity into a relationship that had zero liquidity. Judith had a saying that she made me repeat until it was etched into my brain. "Do not win with a scream," she would say, tapping her pen on the table. "Win with evidence. Screaming is emotional. Screaming makes you look unstable. Evidence is undeniable. Evidence does not care about your feelings. You lay it out, you step back, and you let the facts do the violence for you." I lived by that rule at North Bay. I saved clients millions of dollars by being the person who noticed the one sentence in a 50-page agreement that would have bankrupted them. I destroyed the reputations of con artists by simply publishing their own bank statements, but I never applied it to my family. I kept my work self and my home self completely separate. I treated my family with soft gloves, swallowing their insults, absorbing their neglect, and paying their bills like a silent benefactor. Until the wedding, until Brielle decided that my presence was so offensive that I did not deserve a plate of food. Until my parents decided that my humiliation was an acceptable price to pay for a smooth reception. Standing in that hallway, clutching the USB drive, I realized that my two worlds were finally colliding. I was done being the sister. I was done being the daughter. Tonight, I was the consultant. Tonight, the Holmes family and Nolan Vance were not my relatives. They were a liability case that needed to be closed. I thought about Judith's rule. I was not going to scream. I was not going to throw a drink in Brielle's face or flip a table. That was what the old Lucy would have fantasized about. The new Lucy, the one trained by the sharpest mind in risk management, knew better. I had the evidence. I had the contracts. I had the emails. I had the financial records that proved the shiny, perfect life they were celebrating was a hollow shell built on lies and fraud. I walked toward the hotel lobby, my heels clicking on the marble floor with a steady, rhythmic beat. I was not just angry, I was efficient. And as I saw the figure waiting for me near the check-in desk, I knew the final piece of the puzzle was falling into place. The time for paying secret bills was over. It was time to present the invoice. Nolan Vance entered our lives not like a person, but like a product launch. He was undeniably handsome in that specific, polished way that suggests a lot of time spent in front of mirrors and high-end dermatologists. He had a jawline that could cut glass and hair that never seemed to move, even in a strong wind. He spoke in complete paragraphs, his voice a deep, resonant baritone that made everything he said sound like a keynote address at a Davos summit. To my sister, Brielle, he was Prince Charming. To my parents, Mark and Diane, he was something even better. He was validation. My father looked at Nolan and saw the son he had always wanted but never had. Mark was obsessed with status, but he had topped out at middle management in a regional sales firm. Nolan, however, projected the aura of the 1%. He wore bespoke suits. He drove a leased luxury sedan that smelled of leather and success. He ordered wine by the region, not the price. Mark started walking taller just being near him, as if Nolan's supposed wealth was contagious. But the first time I shook Nolan's hand at the engagement dinner, I felt the hair on my arms stand up. It was not a handshake. It was a transaction. He took my hand, but his eyes were not on me. They were doing a rapid, predatory sweep of the room. He was assessing the environment. He looked at my father's watch, a mid-range Tag Heuer, my mother's jewelry, real gold, but dated, and the furniture, Ethan Allen, 10 years old. He was calculating the net worth of the room in real time. When his eyes finally landed on me, they went flat. I was wearing a simple blouse and slacks. I had no expensive jewelry. I had no visible status markers. In less than a second, Nolan Vance categorized me. I was not a threat, and I was not an asset. Therefore, I was furniture. "Nice to meet you, Lucy," he said, releasing my hand before the social protocol was technically finished. "Brielle mentions you sometimes." He turned his back on me immediately to compliment my mother on her pot roast, launching into a soliloquy about how it reminded him of a bistro he frequented in Lyon. I sat there, watching him charm my parents, and I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. I knew this type. I had seen them in boardrooms during hostile takeovers. They are the ones who smile the widest right before they gut the pension fund. Over the next few months, I tried to get a read on him. It was difficult because Nolan was a master of the non-answer. I asked him one evening what exactly he did for a living. The family had been throwing around terms like finance and tech, but no one seemed to have a business card. "I work in strategic asset alignment," Nolan said, swirling his brandy snifter. "I connect high-value capital with emerging market opportunities. Ideally, I facilitate the synergy between vision and liquidity." It was a perfect sentence. It was grammatically correct, sounded intelligent, and meant absolutely nothing. "Which firm are you with?" I asked. "Or are you independent?" He smiled, a tight flexing of muscles that did not reach his eyes. "I operate a boutique consultancy," he said. "We prefer to stay under the radar. Heavy regulation stifles innovation. You know?" My father nodded vigorously, as if he understood, appearing desperate to be part of the club. "Exactly," Mark said. "Too much red tape in this country." I did not press further, but I made a mental note. Boutique consultancy usually meant unemployed with a website, or worse, employed in something illegal. The real crack in the mask happened during the final dress fitting. Brielle had invited me, mostly because she needed someone to hold her purse and tell her she looked thinner than the mannequin. We were at an upscale bridal salon in downtown Denver. Brielle had been standing on the pedestal for 45 minutes in a dress that weighed 30 pounds. She was sweating, her face was pale, and she was clearly dehydrated. The door opened, and Nolan walked in. He was not supposed to see the dress, technically, but he had insisted on checking the production value of the garment. He stopped in the doorway. He looked at Brielle, who was trembling slightly from exhaustion. A normal fiancé would have said, "You look beautiful," or, "Do you need a chair?" Nolan did not look at her face. He looked at the lace on the hem. "Is this the French Chantilly option?" he asked the stylist. "Yes, sir," the stylist said. "It is an upgrade." "And the total package cost for the venue?" Nolan asked, pivoting to check his phone. "Did we lock in the rate before the seasonal hike? I am seeing a variance in the catering line item that concerns me." Brielle let out a small, shaky breath. "Nolan, I feel a little faint." Nolan held up a finger, silencing her without looking up from his screen. "Just a second. Babe, I need to clarify this corkage fee. If they are charging us $30 a bottle for opening wine we brought, that is a margin erosion I'm not comfortable with." I stepped forward. I took a bottle of water from the side table and handed it to Brielle. Then I turned to Nolan. "Nolan, she's about to pass out," I said. "Can the corkage fee wait?" He looked at me with genuine irritation, as if the toaster had suddenly started giving him financial advice. "We are talking about a $4,000 discrepancy." "Lucy," he said coldly, "details matter. If you do not watch the pennies, the millions walk away." He eventually let her sit down. But the moment stuck with me. He did not care about Brielle. He cared about the event. He cared about the image of the wedding, the display of wealth, and the control of the budget. Brielle was just the mannequin he was dressing up to play the role of the successful wife. I tried to talk to her in the parking lot. "Brielle, surely you see that is not normal," I said gently. He asked about a fee before he asked if you were okay. Brielle slammed her car door. "You are so jealous." "Lucy," she hissed, "you have always been jealous. You see a man who is successful and focused, and you try to tear him down because you are alone. He is handling the finances because he wants our future to be secure. Stop trying to ruin my joy." I stopped trying. Then came the email. 2 weeks before the wedding, the final itinerary and guest protocol were sent out to the invite list. It was a 5-page PDF, beautifully designed, detailing the dress code, black tie optional, no primary colors, the social media hashtag, and the schedule. Buried on page 4, under reception logistics, was a paragraph that made my blood run cold. Due to the exclusive nature of the culinary experience, the curated 6-course tasting menu is reserved for the wedding party and designated Tier 1 guests. Single guests not part of the primary procession are requested to self-manage their dietary requirements. The venue asks that no outside food be consumed in the ballroom. I read it 3 times. Tier 1 guests. I checked the guest list. I was the only family member not in the wedding party. I was the only single guest from the immediate family. It was a direct order. I was invited to watch, but not to eat. It was petty. It was cruel. It was exactly the kind of move a man like Nolan makes to assert dominance over someone he considers a non-entity. He was cutting costs, and he was cutting me out, proving that he could humiliate me and my parents would likely sign off on it to keep the peace. I did not reply to the email. I did not call my mother to scream. Instead, I opened my laptop. If Nolan Vance wanted to play games with details, I would oblige him. He talked a lot about synergy and vision, but people who use those words usually leave a paper trail of people they have scammed. I logged into my secure server at North Bay. I pulled up a background check utility that costs $500 a search, a tool that digs deeper than Google, accessing credit headers, civil court filings in all 50 states, and alias registries. I typed in Nolan Vance. The search bar spun for a moment. I sat back, sipping my tea, my eyes fixed on the screen. He wanted to treat me like a detail? Fine. I was going to become the detail that destroyed him. When the first result popped up, it was not for a Nolan Vance. It was for a man named Noah Vancetti, with a last known address in a foreclosure block in Nevada. I leaned in. The game was on. The digital trail under the name Noah Vancetti was compelling. But in my line of work, digital dirt is only the starting point. You need physical corroboration. A name change can be explained away, perhaps a difficult childhood or a desire to reinvent oneself. But behavior? Behavior never lies, especially when the subject thinks they are unobserved. The wedding weekend approached like a slow-moving storm front. The atmosphere in the house was frantic. Brielle was operating on a diet of celery sticks and adrenaline, snapping at anyone who moved too slowly. My parents were floating in a bubble of self-congratulatory bliss, convinced they were about to ascend to the upper echelons of society. But I was watching Nolan. 3 days before we were set to drive to Carmel. I came downstairs at 2 a.m. to get a glass of water. The house was dark, but a sliver of light bled from under the door of my father's study. Nolan was staying in the guest room, but he had commandeered the study for late-night international calls. I did not turn on the kitchen light. I stood in the hallway, my bare feet silent on the hardwood, and I listened. Through the heavy oak door, Nolan's voice was muffled, but the tone was distinct. Gone was the smooth baritone orator who charmed my mother over brunch. This voice was high, tight, and desperate. "I need 48 hours, he hissed. "Just give me 2 more days. The event is the collateral. You will see the photos. It is all there." A pause. "No, do not call the venue. If you spook them, the whole thing collapses, and you get nothing. I am telling you, the liquidity is coming. I just need to get through the weekend." I held my breath. He wasn't talking to a bank. You do not tell a bank that the event is the collateral. He was talking to a loan shark, or perhaps an investor he had defrauded who was demanding a return. The next morning, the cracks became visible in the daylight. We were at the kitchen table. Nolan was signing a stack of checks for final vendor payments that Brielle had prepared. He looked fresh, showered, and cologne-drenched. But when he picked up the pen, I saw it. It was a micro-tremor in his right hand. To an untrained eye, it might have looked like he had just had too much coffee, but I had seen that tremor before. I had seen it in CEOs who knew the FBI was in the lobby. I had seen it in embezzlers the moment before I slid the evidence across the table. It is the physiological response to the fear of total annihilation. He gripped the pen so hard, his knuckles turned white, forcing the ink onto the paper to mask the shake. He was terrified. I went back to my room and opened my laptop. I needed to see inside the machine. I did not hack him. I did not have to. Brielle, in her organizational frenzy, had been forwarding me every single email chain related to the wedding logistics, mostly so she could bark orders at me to follow up on things. Lucy, make sure the florist knows about the allergies, she would write, forwarding a thread with 20 previous replies. I started digging through the bottom of those threads. Most people only read the top message. I read the history. In a thread with the lighting rental company, buried 3 weeks back, there was a message from an accounts receivable clerk. Dear Mr. Vance, the credit card on file ending in 4098 has returned a declined code. Please update the method of payment to avoid cancellation. Nolan's reply was smooth. My bank flags transactions over $5,000 for security. I will use a different card. I searched for declined in my inbox. It was everywhere. The caterer, the limousine service, the band. In each instance, the initial payment had bounced or been flagged, and Nolan had spun a story about fraud protection algorithms or asset transfers. He was playing a shell game, moving money from one maxed-out card to another, robbing Peter to pay Paul, just to keep the lights on for one more day. I called the event planner, a woman named Sarah, who sounded like she had not slept in a month. Hi, Sarah, I said, keeping my voice breezy. Just checking in for Brielle. She wanted to confirm that the final deposit for the venue was cleared. She is so anxious. You know how brides are. There was a long pause on the other end. Well, Sarah said, choosing her words carefully, we did receive a wire transfer this morning. It is pending clearance. But Mr. Vance assured us it is from a domestic account, so it should be fine. It has been a bit of a scramble. Honestly, he has changed the billing contact on the contract 3 times in the last month. 3 times? I asked. Yes. First it was his LLC, then a personal trust, and now it is coming from it is a third-party holding company, but as long as it clears by Saturday, we are good. I hung up. Changing billing contacts that frequently is a classic money laundering technique, or the sign of someone desperately trying to find an account that hasn't been frozen yet. I needed a second opinion. I took a photo of the printed venue contract Brielle had left on the coffee table and sent it to Judith via an encrypted messaging app. Judith, look at clause 14b. I typed. Judith replied, 4 minutes later, standard protective language for high-risk events. She wrote, in the event of a payment dispute or reversal of funds post-service initiation, the venue reserves the right to immediately cease all operations, withhold food and beverage, and remove guests from the premises. He is floating the payments. I replied, he is betting on the fact that the venue won't pull the plug in the middle of a wedding because of bad PR. Risky, Judith wrote back. If the wire doesn't settle within 24 hours, the system auto-flags it. He is walking a tightrope over a fire pit. It all made sense. The strategic asset alignment, the focus on image, the refusal to spend money on anything that didn't show up in a photo. Nolan wasn't rich. He was using the wedding as a stage set. He needed the photos of him in a tuxedo, surrounded by wealthy people, my parents, pretending to be rich, drinking expensive champagne. He needed to show those photos to his investors to prove he was a man of substance, so they would give him the money he needed to pay off the debts he was incurring right now. It was a Ponzi scheme of social capital, and my sister was the prop. I sat there, staring at the screen. I had the motive. I had the method. I had the behavioral analysis, but I still had a problem. If I stood up in the middle of the reception and yelled, "He is a fraud!" no one would believe me. I was the jealous sister. I was the one who wasn't eating. Mark would drag me out. Brielle would scream that I was ruining her life. Nolan would smooth his jacket and say I was mentally unstable, and everyone would believe the guy in the $3,000 suit over the girl at the empty table. I needed credibility. I needed a voice that carried more weight than mine. I needed a ghost from his past. We drove to Carmel on Friday. The resort was breathtaking. Cliffs, ocean, cypress trees, everything money could buy. I parked my 10-year-old sedan between a Bentley and a Porsche in the valet circle. I walked into the lobby, my garment bag slung over my shoulder. The air was cool and smelled of sea salt. Guests were milling about, looking expensive and relaxed. I went to the front desk to check in. As I was handing over my credit card for incidentals, since Nolan had certainly not covered my room, I felt a presence beside me. It was a woman. She was standing at the far end of the counter, speaking to the concierge. She was in her 50s, wearing a charcoal gray pantsuit that was tailored to within an inch of its life. She had short, steel gray hair and the posture of a retired general. She wasn't a wedding guest. She didn't have the soft, celebratory look. She looked like she was there to foreclose on the building. I wouldn't have noticed her, except for one thing. She was holding a file folder, and on the tab of that folder, written in sharp, black marker, was a name, Vanzetti. My heart hammered against my ribs. It was the name from the background check, the real name. I finished my check-in, took my key, and waited. When she turned away from the desk, looking frustrated, I stepped into her path. I didn't smile. I didn't offer a polite greeting. I used the technique Judith had taught me for intercepting a target. I looked her straight in the eye and spoke with absolute certainty. "You are not here for the wedding," I said. "You are here for the money he stole." The woman stopped. Her eyes narrowed, sharp and dangerous. She looked me up and down, assessing me just as ruthlessly as I had assessed Nolan. "Who are you?" she asked. Her voice was like gravel wrapped in velvet. "I am the sister of the bride," I said, "and I think we have the same problem." She stared at me for a long beat, silence stretching between us. Then, the corner of her mouth twitched upward. It wasn't a smile. It was the look of a hunter who just found a second gun. "Buy me a drink," she said. We walked toward the hotel bar. As we moved, I felt the final piece of the trap snap into place. I had my evidence, and now I had my executioner. The hotel bar was a dimly lit sanctuary of polished mahogany and velvet, a stark contrast to the frenetic energy of the wedding preparations outside. We sat at a corner table, far from the prying eyes of guests who were busy checking into their rooms. I ordered a sparkling water. The woman ordered a double scotch. Neat. She did not touch the drink immediately. She sat with her hands clasped on the table, her posture rigid, studying me with eyes that had seen too many balance sheets and not enough mercy. "You found the name," she stated. It was not a question. "I did," I replied, keeping my voice level. "Noah Vanzetti, foreclosures in Nevada, a dissolved LLC in Florida, and now Nolan Vance in California." She nodded slowly, a grim expression settling on her face. "I am Marla Vance," she said. "I am his aunt. His father was my brother." I blinked, surprised. I had expected a scorned investor or a creditor. I had not expected blood. "You are family?" I asked. "Technically," she said, picking up her glass. "But in our family, that word does not mean much. I cut ties with his branch of the tree 10 years ago. I worked as an internal auditor for a major defense contractor for 30 years. I spent my life hunting down people who fudge numbers, hide assets, and lie to shareholders. It is a cruel irony that the worst offender I know shares my DNA." She took a sip of the scotch, wincing slightly as it went down. "I ran a full background check on your family the moment I heard he was getting married again." She continued, "I wanted to see who the next mark was. I saw the parents, desperate for status, financially overextended. I saw the sister, vain, easily manipulated. And then I saw you." She leaned forward, her gaze piercing. "You are Lucy," she said, "the one who works for North Bay, the risk consultant." A chill went down my spine. I had spent 5 years keeping my career hidden from my family, yet this stranger had dismantled my cover in a single sentence. "How do you know that?" I asked. Marla smiled. But it was a cold, sharp thing, because real recognizes real. "Lucy, you are the only person in that entire clan with a credit score that isn't on life support and a digital footprint that suggests you actually read the terms and conditions. I figured if anyone was going to figure him out, it would be you. But I was worried I was too late. Why are you here?" Marla, I asked, if you cut ties, why fly all the way to Carmel? She set the glass down with a heavy thud. Because of the liability, she said, Nolan isn't just a liar, he is a contagion. When he goes down, and he always goes down, he drags everyone attached to him into the wreckage. I am not here to save him. I am here because I found out he put my name down as a guarantor on a shell company he used to secure the vendor contracts for this circus. He forged my signature. My jaw tightened. Forgery. That moved this from a civil dispute to a felony. He is trying to use my clean record to wash his dirty money. She said, and I am here to make sure that when the police come, they know exactly who held the pen. But more than that, I know how he operates. He gets the wife to sign the secondary papers, the ones that transfer the debt liability to the spouse in the event of default. Has your sister signed anything recently? I thought back to the frantic mornings at the kitchen table. Brielle signing stacks of documents without reading them, just wanting to get the admin over with. She signed everything he put in front of her. I whispered. Marla closed her eyes for a brief second. Then she is walking into a bear trap, she said. Once they say, I do, that debt becomes marital property in the state of California, depending on how he structured the prenuptial agreements, if he even let her have a lawyer look at them. He didn't. I said, he used his own family attorney, Marla scoffed. He doesn't have an attorney. He has a guy who prints certificates off the internet. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I navigated to the photo of the venue contract I had taken earlier. Marla, look at this, I said, sliding the phone across the polished wood. Clause 14b. Marla put on a pair of reading glasses she pulled from her blazer pocket. She read the text, her lips moving silently. When she looked up, there was a glint of appreciation in her eyes. The suspension clause. She said, immediate cessation of services upon payment dispute. I nodded. He has been floating the payments on credit cards that are cycling through approval and decline. He is betting that the hotel won't dare stop the wedding once the guests are seated. He thinks he can bully them with the threat of a bad review. Marla tapped a manicured fingernail on the screen. He is wrong, she said softly. This is a corporate-owned resort. The manager doesn't care about feelings. He cares about the corporate audit. If the wire doesn't hit the bank by the time the appetizers are served, the system locks the account. She handed the phone back to me. That is our leverage, she said. So what is the plan? I asked. Do we call the police? Do we tell my parents? Marla shook her head. If you tell your parents, they will deny it. They will say you are jealous. They will warn him, and he will run. If we call the police now, it is just a civil dispute until the checks actually bounce. No, we cannot stop the train. We have to let it crash. She looked toward the lobby, where the first guests were starting to drift toward the ballroom, dressed in their sequins and tuxedos. I am going to speak to the general manager, Marla said. I am going to show him the proof of the forged guarantee. I am going to tell him that the funds backing this event are fraudulent. He will cancel the wedding before it starts. I said, no, Marla corrected me. He won't cancel it. He will invoke the clause. He will wait until the service begins, and then he will demand immediate payment verification. When Nolan cannot provide it, the show stops. It is brutal. I said, it is necessary. She replied, the only way to break a narcissist's hold on a victim is public exposure. Brielle needs to see him not as her prince, but as the man who humiliated her. It is the only way she will leave him. If we save her quietly, she will go back to him in a month. I sat back, absorbing the weight of it. It was a surgical strike. It was exactly the kind of plan Judith would have approved of. We are going to ruin my sister's wedding, I said. Marla stood up, smoothing her suit jacket. We are saving her life. Lucy, the wedding is just the casualty. She turned to leave, but stopped. I will see you inside, she said. I have asked the manager for a microphone. I think it is time the groom's side of the family gave a toast. I watched her walk away, a soldier marching into battle. My phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text from my mother. Diane, I saw you talking to some stranger. Get to the ballroom. And remember, do not make a scene today. If you ruin this for your sister, I will never forgive you." I stared at the screen. The irony was so thick it tasted like metal in my mouth. She was worried about me making a scene. She had no idea that the scene was already written, the stage was set, and the actors were taking their places. I stood up and walked toward the ballroom. The doors were open, spilling golden light and soft jazz into the hallway. I could hear the laughter. I could hear the clinking of glasses. I walked in, not as the poor relation, not as the failure, but as the only person in the room who knew that the floor was about to drop out. I found my empty table in the shadows, stood behind my chair, and waited for the performance to begin. The reception was in full swing, a symphony of indulgence that I was explicitly excluded from conducting. I sat at table 29, which was still as barren as a desert. Around me, the air was thick with the scent of truffle oil and roasted sea bass, heavy aromas that settled in my stomach like lead. Waiters in white jackets moved through the room with the precision of a military drill, depositing plates of food that looked like art projects in front of every guest except me. I watched a server approach my station. He held a pitcher of ice water, the outside frosted with condensation. He filled the glasses at table 28. He pivoted, looked at me, and then stepped back. "Excuse me," I said, my voice barely carrying over the jazz quartet. "May I just have some water?" He looked at me with eyes devoid of sympathy. It was the look of a man who had been threatened with termination if he deviated from the script. "This station is self-managed, miss," he recited. "There is a water fountain near the restrooms in the lobby." He turned and walked away. The humiliation was no longer sharp. It was a dull, throbbing ache. It was a physical reminder of my place in the family hierarchy. I was not a guest. I was a prop, placed in the corner to make the center look brighter by comparison. Then came the bride. Brielle swept through the tables, her train gathered in one hand, a glass of champagne in the other. She was glowing, fueled by the adoration of 200 people. She stopped at a table of her college sorority sisters near mine, accepting their compliments, basking in the light. Then she turned to me. Her smile did not waver, but her eyes hardened. She leaned down, pitching her voice just loud enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Oh, Lucy," she said, "you are still sitting here? I honestly thought you would have had the dignity to leave by now. It is a little pathetic, isn't it? Sitting at an empty table like a dog waiting for scraps." The sorority sisters giggled. A few men at the next table turned around, smirking. They were enjoying the show. To them, this was just witty banter between sisters, not a systematic dismantling of my self-worth. I looked over at my parents. They were seated at the head table, the kings and queens of this farce. My father, Mark, caught my eye. He saw Brielle leaning over me. He saw the guests laughing. He stood up and walked over, his face flushed with wine and irritation. "Brielle, honey, come back to the head table," he said gently to her. Then he turned to me, his voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Lucy, if you are not having a good time, just go home. Stop bringing the mood down. You are making people uncomfortable." "Mom?" I asked, looking past him to where Diane sat. She looked at me, then picked up her wineglass and took a long sip. Turning her head to speak to Nolan's mother, she had chosen her side. She had chosen the side that promised her status, ignoring the daughter who had paid to fix her roof. I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was the calm of a demolition expert who has just set the final charge. I stood up. I did not shake. I did not cry. I smoothed the front of my dress and looked my father in the eye. "I am not the one making people uncomfortable. Dad," I said. My voice was steady, clearer than it had been in years. "But I suggest you hold on to that wineglass tightly. I hope you all can handle the truth." Mark frowned, confusion clouding his irritation. "What are you talking about?" Before he could answer, the sound of feedback whined through the speaker system. We all turned. Standing at the front of the room, near the bandstand, was Marla Vance. She had not asked for permission. She had simply walked up to the lead singer, whispered something that made him pale, and taken the microphone from his hand. She stood in the center of the dance floor, a solitary figure in a gray suit amidst a sea of sequins and tuxedos. She looked like a judge walking into a courtroom. "Excuse me," she said. Her voice boomed through the speakers, cutting through the chatter. The room went silent. Forks paused halfway to mouths. "I am Marla Vance," she announced. "I am the groom's aunt, and since I was not asked to give a toast, I decided to invite myself." At the head table, Nolan froze. He was holding a forkful of sea bass, and it dropped onto his plate with a dull clatter. His face, which had been flushed with triumph moments ago, drained of color so fast it looked like the blood had been sucked out of him. Brielle, oblivious to the terror radiating off her new husband, let out a short, derisive laugh. She stood up, waving her hand dismissively. "Oh, look," she called out, her voice shrill in the quiet room. "Dissenting relatives? Diane, are you going to praise us? We really don't have time for long speeches." Marla did not look at Brielle. She looked straight at Nolan. The intensity of her gaze was so powerful that I saw Nolan physically flinch. "I am not here to praise you, Brielle," Marla said, her voice dropping an octave, becoming deadly serious. "And I am not here to celebrate." She took a step forward. "I am here to stop my nephew from using this marriage as a financial shield," she said. "I am here because I will not let him use this family as collateral for his fraud." The word fraud hung in the air like a gunshot. A gasp rippled through the room. My mother dropped her napkin. Mark stood there, his mouth slightly open, looking from Marla to Nolan. Nolan snapped out of his paralysis. He scrambled up from his chair, knocking it over. "Cut the mic!" he shouted, his voice cracking. "Security! Get her out of here! She is crazy. She is estranged." He rushed toward the dance floor, his movements frantic and uncoordinated. He looked like a trapped animal. Marla did not flinch. She did not retreat. She stood her ground, planting her feet firmly. "I am not crazy, Nolan," she said into the microphone, her voice steady and amplified. "And I am not leaving until these people know exactly who they just married into." Nolan lunged for the microphone stand. Marla was faster. She pivoted, pulling the mic stand back and turning her body so that Nolan grabbed only empty air. He stumbled, nearly falling onto the dance floor. Marla brought the microphone back to her lips. She wasn't just speaking to the room anymore. She was speaking to the entire facade he had built. "You forged my signature, Nolan," she said. "You forged it to pay for this room, and now, the bill is due." Nolan reached out again, desperate, his hand clawing at the wire. The movement caused a piercing, high-pitched screech of audio feedback to tear through the room. A sharp screech of feedback. The sound was agonizing. Guests covered their ears. The room seemed to freeze in that moment of sonic violence. I watched from my empty table, my heart pounding a rhythm of absolute vindication. The silence that followed the screech was heavy, electric, and terrifying. The curtain had been ripped down. The play was over, and the real show was just beginning. The audio feedback died down, leaving a ringing silence in its wake that was louder than any scream. Marla stood in the center of the dance floor, her silhouette sharp against the uplights. She did not look like a wedding crasher. She looked like a federal prosecutor delivering a closing argument. She reached into her blazer and pulled out a folded sheaf of papers. She did not wave them around theatrically. She simply held them up, letting the stage lights catch the white brightness of the pages. "You all believe Nolan is the vice president of strategic partnerships at Apex Capital," Marla said. Her voice was calm, projecting clearly to the back of the room where I stood. "He told you he manages a portfolio worth $50 million. He told you he was brokering a merger in Tokyo last month." She unfolded the first document. "This is a termination letter from Apex Capital, dated October 14th of last year." She read, "Nolan was not a vice president. He was a junior analyst on a probationary contract, and he was not fired for market conditions. He was terminated for falsifying expense reports and attempting to access restricted client accounts. A ripple went through the room. It was the sound of 200 people simultaneously shifting in their chairs. Brielle, standing at the head table, looked at Nolan. Her face was a mask of confusion, the first crack in the porcelain doll facade. "Nolan?" she asked, her voice trembling. "You went to Tokyo. I saw the plane ticket." Nolan's laugh was brittle, a dry sound that sounded like stepping on dead leaves. "Babe, don't listen to her," he said, wiping sweat from his forehead with a shaking hand. "She is bitter. She was cut out of the will years ago. This is just a Photoshop job." Marla ignored him. She dropped the first paper to the floor and held up the second. "And the plane ticket?" Marla continued. "He booked it, screenshotted the confirmation, and canceled it within the 24-hour refund window. He spent that week in a motel in Reno, gambling with the deposit money meant for the florist. A man in a black tuxedo stood up near the back of the room. It was the owner of the floral design company. "He is right," the florist said. His voice was thick with anger. "We never got the second installment. He sent me a wire confirmation number that the bank said didn't exist. I only delivered the flowers today because he swore his assistant made a clerical error." Nolan spun around, pointing a finger at the vendor. "Sit down," he shouted. "You will get your money. This is a private event." "This is not a private event," Marla cut in, her voice slicing through his panic. "It is a crime scene in progress." She took a step closer to the head table, looking directly at my father. "Mark, you think you found a wealthy son-in-law. Mark, you found a parasite. But the worst part is not that he lied about his job. It is how he paid for this party." She gestured to the room, to the crystal chandeliers and the silk drapes. "He didn't pay for it," she said. "Brielle did." Brielle blinked, shaking her head. "No, Nolan takes care of the finances. He said he wanted to treat me." Marla looked at her with something almost like pity. "Read the fine print of the wedding planner contract he made you sign last week. Brielle, the one he said was just an insurance formality." Marla held up the final document. "It contains a primary obligor clause," she explained. "It states that in the event of default by the primary payer, which is Nolan's shell company, the liability transfers immediately and in full to the secondary signatory. That is you, Brielle. He didn't marry you. He recruited you as a co-signer." Brielle turned to Nolan. The adoration was gone, replaced by a dawning horror. "Nolan," she whispered, "tell me that is not true." Nolan reached for her arm, his grip tight. "This is not the time, Brielle," he hissed, his charming mask dissolving into pure malice. "We are doing this later. Smile. There are cameras. Don't touch me," Brielle shrieked, jerking her arm away. The tension in the room snapped. The murmuring exploded into open conversation. People were standing up, pointing, pulling out their phones to record. Suddenly, the double doors at the side of the ballroom opened. A tall man with silver hair and an impeccable tuxedo walked in. It was Mr. Henderson, the general manager of the resort. He was flanked by 2 large security guards. He did not look happy. He walked with the heavy, purposeful stride of a man who was about to protect his bottom line. He walked past the head table. He walked past Marla. He walked straight toward my corner. The room watched, confused. Why was the manager walking toward the empty table? "Mr." Henderson stopped in front of me. He looked at me, and his severe expression softened into recognition. "Ms. Holmes," he said. "Mr. Henderson," I replied, nodding my head. "I did not realize you were connected to this party," he said, his voice carrying in the sudden hush. "If I had known North Bay Strategy was involved, I would have flagged the risk profile of this contract weeks ago. You saved me a fortune during the grand opening crisis 3 years ago." The guests turned to look at me. My father's jaw dropped. My mother looked as if she had been slapped. They had spent years telling people I was a nobody, a failure who fixed computers from home. And here was the manager of the most exclusive resort in California, treating me like a peer. "I appreciate that, Mr. Henderson," I said, But I'm not here on business. I am just a guest without a meal. Mr. Henderson's lips thinned. He turned his back on me and faced the head table. He looked at Nolan with absolute disdain. Mr. Vance, he said, his voice cold and administrative. As per the conversation I just had with your aunt and the verification of your credit status, I am invoking Clause 14 immediately. What? Nolan sputtered. You can't do that. We are in the middle of dinner. I am, Mr. Henderson said. He raised his hand and snapped his fingers. The doors to the kitchen swung open, but no food came out. Instead, the service staff marched in, empty-handed. They moved to the tables and began lifting the champagne buckets. They took the wine bottles. At the far end of the room, the double doors opened to reveal the wedding cake, a 7-tier architectural marvel, being wheeled out on a cart. The guests watched in stunned silence as the staff stopped the cart, turned it around, and wheeled it back into the kitchen. Hey, Mark shouted, standing up. That is our cake. We paid for that. Mr. Henderson looked at my father. Actually, sir, the credit card on file was reported stolen 40 minutes ago. No one has paid for anything. And until $50,000 is wired to our corporate account, not a single crumb of food will be served in this room. Service is suspended. The room erupted. It was total chaos. Nolan looked around, wild-eyed. He grabbed Brielle's wrist again, hard enough to leave a mark. We are leaving, he snarled, pulling her toward the exit. We are going to the suite. Now! Brielle dug her heels into the carpet. The princess fantasy was dead. The dress was just heavy fabric, and the man pulling her was a stranger. No! She screamed, slapping his hand away. You liar! You ruined everything! She collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her hands, sobbing. The sound was raw and ugly, echoing off the high ceilings. My parents stood frozen, paralyzed by the public disintegration of their image. They looked at the guests, who were now looking at them not with envy, but with the morbid fascination of seeing a train wreck. I stepped out from behind my empty table. I did not say a word. I did not look at Brielle. I did not look at my parents. I adjusted my purse on my shoulder and began to walk toward the exit. As I walked down the center aisle, the guests parted for me. They pulled their chairs in. They lowered their eyes. 10 minutes ago, they had laughed when Brielle mocked me. They had smirked at my empty table. But now, as I passed them, the laughter was gone. They saw Mr. Henderson bow his head to me as I passed. They saw Marla give me a subtle nod of respect. They saw that I was the only person in the room walking with a straight spine. I could hear the whispers starting behind me, but they were different now. They weren't mocking. They were fearful. Who is she? I heard someone whisper, She is the one who knew. Someone else answered. I pushed open the heavy doors and stepped out into the cool night air. The silence of the corridor was heavy, but it felt clean. Behind me, inside the ballroom, the shouting was getting louder. The accusations were flying, and the perfect family portrait was burning to the ground. I kept walking. I didn't look back. The fallout from the wedding was not a slow burn. It was an explosion, magnified by the lens of 1,000 smartphones. By the time I drove back to my apartment in San Francisco on Sunday morning, the video was already trending. Someone had filmed the exact moment Mr. Henderson snapped his fingers to recall the wedding cake. The clip was titled, The Caramel Crash, and it had 2 million views. There were memes of Marla holding the microphone like a weapon. There were slow-motion edits of Brielle's face crumbling as the waiters marched out with the champagne. It was the kind of schadenfreude the internet devours, a high society disaster where the rich and arrogant get their comeuppance in high definition. Nolan Vance did not stick around to check the view count. He vanished from the hotel room before the sun came up on Sunday. He took his bespoke suits, his collection of watches, and the remaining cash from the envelope box. When Brielle woke up, swollen-eyed and hysterical, the closet was empty. His phone number was disconnected. His email sent back a bounce message. He had ghosted her with the efficiency of a man who had done this 3 or 4 times before, but he left something behind. He left the debt. The contracts Marla had warned us about were ironclad because Nolan had disappeared, the liability for the venue, the catering, the flowers, and the band fell squarely on the secondary signatory. Brielle was looking at invoices totaling $150,000. She didn't have $150,000. She had a lease on a BMW and a closet full of clothes she bought on credit. My parents were not spared. Mark had co-signed the guarantee for the hotel room block to secure a VIP rate. Now that the wedding was a bust, the hotel was charging full rack rate for 40 rooms that guests had refused to pay for as they checked out in disgust. My phone began to ring on Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp. It was my mother. I let it go to voicemail. Then it was my father. Voicemail. Then Brielle. Voicemail. They did not leave messages apologizing for starving me. They did not leave messages asking if I was okay after the stress of the weekend. I listened to one voicemail from Mark. His voice was tight, bordering on panic. "Lucy, pick up the phone. We need you to call that manager. Mr. Henderson, he likes you. You need to smooth this over. Tell him it was a misunderstanding, and we need you to look at these contracts. Brielle says they are illegal. You know about this stuff. Fix it. We are a family. Fix it." That was the summary of my existence in the Holmes household. I was the mechanic they kept in the basement, summoned only when the engine of their vanity broke down. I sat at my kitchen counter, drinking coffee, staring at the phone. For the first time in my life, the guilt did not come. Usually, the sound of my mother's distress would trigger a reflex to open my checkbook. I would scramble to make calls, to negotiate, to shield them from the consequences of their own choices. But I remembered the empty table. I remembered the waiter telling me I was self-managed. I picked up the phone and typed a single text message. I sent it to a group chat containing Mark, Diane, and Brielle. I am not a resource. I am not a fixer. And I will certainly not be the invisible wallet anymore. Do not contact me until you have hired a lawyer. Then I blocked their numbers. The silence that followed was the most expensive thing I had ever bought, and it was worth every penny. In the weeks that followed, the invisible supports I had placed around my family began to snap one by one. I stopped paying the premiums on the life insurance policies I had secretly taken over. I canceled the auto-renewal on the home warranty plan for the house in Fort Collins. I removed my credit card from the landscaping company's file. The decline of the Holmes dynasty was rapid and visible. My cousin texted me that the grass at the family home had turned yellow because the sprinkler system broke and Mark refused to pay the exorbitant repair fee. Not knowing I had subsidized the last 3 repairs, the roof leak I had fixed 2 years ago reappeared in the guest bedroom, ruining the hardwood floors. They were learning a hard lesson in economics. The lifestyle they thought they could afford was actually a lifestyle I had been purchasing for them. While their world shrank, mine expanded. Mr. Henderson had meant what he said. On Tuesday, I received a call from the CEO of a luxury resort chain in Napa. He had heard about the incident at Carmel. He didn't want to hire me to stop a wedding. He wanted to hire North Bay Strategy to audit their vendor contracts for fraud. That contract alone was worth $40,000. My reputation as the woman who stayed calm while the cake was rolled away became a strange sort of professional currency. In the world of crisis management, stoicism is a premium asset. I signed 3 new clients in 10 days. I was working 18-hour days. But for the first time, I was working for myself, not for the approval of people who would never give it. I met Judith for lunch 3 weeks after the wedding. We sat on a patio overlooking the bay. She looked at me over the rim of her glasses. "You look different," she said. "I feel different," I admitted. "I feel light. Just be careful," Judith warned, cutting into her salad. Narcissists do not handle boundaries well. When you cut off the supply, whether it is attention or money, they get desperate, and desperate people get creative. Do not assume they are done with you just because you block their calls. I laughed. What can they do? They have no money, no leverage, and no credibility. They are busy fighting lawsuits from 3 different florists. Judith didn't smile. Just keep your eyes open, Lucy. The snake bites hardest when you step on its tail. I should have listened. I should have remembered that my family's sense of entitlement did not adhere to the laws of logic. One evening, a month after the disaster, I was sitting in my living room, organizing my personal finances. I was preparing to buy a condo in Monterey, a place of my own, far away from the suburbs of Colorado. As part of the mortgage application, I needed to pull my full credit report from all 3 bureaus. I logged into the secure portal. I watched the progress bar load. I expected to see my usual pristine score. I had never missed a payment. I had 0 debt. I was the model of fiscal responsibility. The report loaded. I scrolled down, scanning the lines. Student loans, paid in full. Car lease, terminated. Credit cards, 0 balance. Then I stopped. At the bottom of the list, under open accounts, there was a new entry. Lender, quick cash unsecured personal loans. Date opened, January 14th. Original balance, $25,000. Status, current. I stared at the date, January 14th. That was the Friday of the wedding weekend. That was the day we drove to Carmel. I had not opened a personal loan. I did not need a personal loan. I had 6 figures in liquid savings. My hands started to tremble, not from fear, but from a rage so cold it felt like ice in my veins. I clicked on the details. The address on file for the loan was not my apartment in San Francisco. It was 42 Oak Creek Drive, Fort Collins, Colorado, my parents' house. I looked at the authorized user list. There was no cosigner. It was just me, or rather, someone pretending to be me. I closed my laptop and sat in the dark. Judith was right. They hadn't just called me to fix the mess. When I didn't answer, they had decided to fix it themselves, using the one resource they felt entitled to. My name. They had stolen my identity. The wedding was over, but the war had just entered a new phase, and this time, it wasn't about humiliation. It was about a felony. I stared at the screen, the blue light reflecting in my eyes, illuminating the betrayal in high definition. The authorized user on the fraudulent credit card account was not a stranger. It was not a faceless hacker. The card had been issued to Diane Holmes. My mother had not just stolen from me. She had impersonated me. She had used my social security number, which she had in her old tax files, to open a line of credit to cover the bouncing checks Nolan had left behind. She had tried to patch the hull of their sinking reputation with my financial future. I did not scream. I did not cry. I picked up the phone and called Judith. 2 days later, we met in a rented conference room in downtown Denver. I chose the location specifically. It was sterile, cold, and neutral. It was not a home. It was a place of business. I sat at the head of the mahogany table. To my right sat Judith, looking like a shark in a silk blouse. To my left sat Arthur, a civil litigation attorney who specialized in family fraud. When my parents and Brielle walked in, they looked like refugees from a war they did not understand they had lost. Mark looked older, his face gray and unshaven. Diane was clutching her handbag as if it contained the last of her oxygen. Brielle looked hollow. She was wearing sweatpants, her hair in a messy bun, the glamour of the wedding completely eroded. They sat down opposite us. Mark looked at the lawyer, then at Judith, and finally at me. His eyes narrowed. "This is ridiculous." "Lucy," Mark snapped, his voice rough. "We are family. You drag us to a lawyer's office? After everything you did?" I remained silent. I let the silence stretch until it became uncomfortable. "If you had just picked up the phone," Mark continued, his volume rising, "none of this would be necessary. We had a liquidity issue. We handled it. We were going to pay you back as soon as the venue refunded the deposit. But no, you had to make a scene at the wedding. And now you are making a scene here. If you hadn't ruined the wedding, we wouldn't be in this mess." He slammed his hand on the table. Arthur, my lawyer, opened a file folder. He did not look up. "Mr. Holmes," he said calmly, "I would advise you to lower your voice. We are not here to discuss the wedding. We are here to discuss a felony." Mark froze. "Felony?" I reached forward and slid a thin black envelope across the table toward them. "Open it," I said. Diane's hands shook as she picked it up. She pulled out a single sheet of paper. It was a printout of the digital log from the credit card application. I spoke clearly, looking directly at my mother. The application was submitted on January 14th at 10:45 in the morning. I said, at that exact time, I was on the highway, driving to Carmel. My phone records prove I was not near a computer. I pulled a USB drive from my pocket and set it on the table with a soft click. However, I continued, the IP address used to submit the application belongs to a Comcast residential account at 42 Oak Creek Drive. Your house? The device used was an iPad registered to Diane Holmes. Diane dropped the paper. She looked at Mark, her eyes wide with panic. "Mark," she whispered, "you said it would be anonymous. You said we just needed a bridge loan." I didn't finish. I leaned forward. "You opened a $25,000 line of credit in my name." I said, "You forged my consent. You added yourself as an authorized user to bypass the security checks. That is identity theft. That is wire fraud. That is punishable by up to 20 years in federal prison." Mark's face turned a violent shade of red. "We are your parents," he shouted. "We raised you. We put a roof over your head. You owe us. We needed the money to stop the hotel from suing us because of what you did." I looked at him with zero emotion. I did not sign the contract. Dad, Brielle did. I slid a second document across the table. It was the vendor agreement Marla had exposed, the one Brielle had blindly signed. "This is the addendum," I said. "Brielle accepted full liability. When Nolan ran, the debt became hers. You didn't steal my identity to save the family name. You stole it to save your own retirement accounts from being garnished to pay her debt." Brielle looked up. She looked at the document, then at her father. "You told me you handled it," she said, her voice cracking. "You told me you used your savings." Mark looked away, refusing to meet her eyes. "I couldn't touch my savings." "Brielle," he muttered, "the penalty for early withdrawal. I have a reputation." Brielle let out a sound that was half laugh, half sob. "You stole from Lucy." She said, "You committed a crime against one daughter to cover up the mistakes of the other, just so you wouldn't look poor." She turned to me. Tears were streaming down her face, stripping away the last of her arrogance. "I treated you like garbage," she whispered. "I mocked you at my wedding. I told everyone you were jealous and useless, and the whole time, you were the only one actually paying the bills. I was just the show pony, wasn't I?" She looked at our parents with pure disgust. I was the prize, and she was the bank. "That is all we were to you." The room went silent. The truth was finally on the table, ugly and undeniable. Arthur cleared his throat. "Here are the options," he said, sliding a thick legal document toward Mark. "Option 1, Arthur said, "you write a check today for the full balance of $25,000 plus legal fees. You sign this document admitting to the fraudulent activity, which we will hold in escrow. You also sign a permanent release, removing yourselves from any authority over Lucy's medical or financial decisions." "And option 2? Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. "Option 2, I said. Standing up, I walk out of this room. I go to the Denver Police Department, and I file a formal report. I hand over the IP logs. I hand over the iPad registry, and I watch you get arrested." Mark looked at the paper. He looked at the sum. He knew he had the money. He had just been too greedy to spend it. He realized that if this went public, his career, his standing at the country club, his entire identity would be destroyed. He picked up the pen. He did not apologize. He did not look at me. He wrote the check with a shaking hand and signed the agreement. Diane was weeping softly, but I felt nothing for her tears. They were tears of embarrassment, not remorse. I took the check. I took the signed agreement. I looked at Brielle. "You should get a lawyer." I told her, "You are going to need one for the divorce and for the bankruptcy." I turned and walked toward the door. Judith stood up and followed me, pausing only to give my parents a look that could have frozen hell over. Lucy. My mother called out. Her voice was weak, desperate. Where are you going? I stopped, my hand on the door handle. I am moving to Monterey. I said, I signed a contract with a resort chain there. I bought a condo with an ocean view. It has a guest room. But don't worry, it will stay empty. I walked out. I walked out of the conference room, out of the building, and into the bright, sharp sunlight of the Colorado afternoon. I took a deep breath. The air tasted different. It didn't taste like guilt anymore. It tasted like freedom. I didn't take revenge by burning their house down. I didn't take revenge by screaming insults. I took revenge by becoming exactly who they said I couldn't be. Successful, independent, and utterly unreachable. They thought I was silent because I was weak. They didn't know I was silent because I was picking the exit. Thank you so much for listening to this story. I would love to know where you are tuning in from today. Are you listening on your commute? At the gym? Or maybe while cooking dinner? Let me know in the comments below so we can connect. If you enjoyed seeing justice served, please make sure to subscribe to the Morgan Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and hit that like button so this story can reach even more people who need a reminder that sometimes the best revenge is just living a better life.